So PAI as an institution is devoted to bringing diverse voices together from global sectors, disciplines, and demographies to think about how AI developments can advance positive outcomes for people and society. And of course, there are prerequisite questions around what those positive outcomes mean, which is really not a technical question at all, and those implicate the development of the technology. And amidst that broad mandate, one area that we identified as really ripe for pursuit are questions around AI and media integrity, and how that in that responsible development and deployment of AI, we can have a positive impact on the information ecosystem, the global information ecosystem, which we believe implicates how we communicate, our sense of well-being, our informedness, and lots of societal dynamics that lead to a positive societal impact. And for the past few years, we've been working at PAI to investigate emerging AI technologies' impact on digital media and online information. And we launched this area around the question of how we deal with AI-generated misinformation, and have since broadened to other areas. But in the synthetic and manipulated content prong of our program, we asked two questions. One is, how do we mitigate the impact of harmful synthetic, manipulated, and misinforming content? But also, how do we actually bolster opportunities for AI to help strengthen pro-social content? And of course, defining what harmful content is and pro-social content is at the crux of the challenge in front of us. And a few things we've done over the past 2 years in this space. Firstly, we've thought about in our work both the malicious use cases for synthetic media, but also the positive ones, particularly in the art domain with some colleagues where we created a responsible AI art field guide. And we hope that platform policies actually reflect this duality and dual use of the technology. Second, we've been really involved in deepfake detection and actually explored its limits most actively. So what are the limits of deepfake detection? How can we broaden and strengthen the detection research field while also recognizing some of the limitations, as you see here, that perturbations in data sets and faces can actually hinder the generalizability of detection systems, and what do we make of that? In light of those detection limits, we've incubated initiatives and collaborations between institutions like those in Project Origin and the Coalition for Content, Provenance, and Authenticity, lots of acronyms, to think about authentication and provenance infrastructure that could be a counterpoint to some of the challenges posed by detection that will legitimize real media. And now that leads us today to our work around reconciling the adversarial realities of deepfake detection with the need to engage stakeholders from journalism, civil society, and other sectors around the world who are really integral to arbitrating content as malicious or manipulated or not, who need access to some of the technical systems that we have been interrogating, while also recognizing the limits of detection as only one part of the solution space for dealing with manipulated content. So that leads us to the workshop today, where we're going to do 3 things. One, we're going to update all of you on PAI and Witness's work on access and detection since last year's tools workshop. That workshop was called the Manipulated Media Detection Tools Workshop. We need to work on our naming conventions for these mouthful meetings, but we want to update you on some of our scholarship and also regional convenings we've collaborated with Witness on here today. Second, we want to actually provide an opportunity for you all to talk to one another. We have folks from academia, media, civil society, industry, and I think those categorizations actually oversimplify the depth of your expertise and the variety of your knowledge, and we want you all to be working together as one part of a broader field. And where the rubber really hits the road is point 3, where we actually want to get at a recommendation for an access protocol that reconciles the desire to share this technology more broadly with stakeholders in the information integrity community, while also not impeding the actual utility of those systems by sharing them more widely. So PAI's work in this space really began with our involvement in the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which was ostensibly just a technical challenge to classify videos as manipulated and fake or not. But by bringing that challenge to the multidisciplinary AI and Media Integrity Steering Committee, it became much more, and other questions around detection governance and access emerged that actually interrogated one particular question, which is, does detection actually help minimize the impact of misleading information and harmful synthetic media? And that's, I think, the question we actually care about. And of course, you can interrogate this question by saying, what percentage or what is the robustness or classification likelihood of a model? I think it was 60% for the DFDC winning models. But you could also say, how does the adversarial nature of detection as a practice hinder its ability to actually deal with the problem at hand, which is malicious synthetic media? And the group posed some of these questions, and two kind of conflicting ideas emerged from that group's input. One was the need to evaluate trade-offs between open access to the technology and the models, and the need to deter adversaries generating synthetic media from kind of outpacing those detection systems. AKA, might we want to stifle access in some way to prevent adversarial access? But at the same time, how do we ensure that the ability to detect synthetic media can be more open and extend to journalists, fact checkers, and those working in civil society who are integral stakeholders in the information integrity field? And it's this tension that we wanted to really unpack through our work. And last year, we began to pose some questions at the tools workshop around this topic. And this year, we've dove in more deeply. In a paper which I collaborated with Aviva Vadia, who should be on this call, and Sean McGregor, we posed an alliterative description of this challenge, which is the deepfake detection dilemma. The idea that as detection practices become more accessible, they also become more easily circumvented. And there's this detection equity question of who has access to these tools and under what terms. And then it trades off against detection utility, meaning how well the tools work. And of course, there are different types of detection technology we see today. Some is privately held, some is open source software. We also have commercial products. And I think what we want to do here is interrogate the best model to reconcile the equity question with the utility question that we posed. And here's just a series of levels of access that we'll use as framing for our discussion today. You should feel free to interrogate these. They can be questioned from most permissive to least restrictive, ranging from complete access to the source code, the training data, the executable software, to developer access only. And something that Sam's going to emphasize in his very informative talk is that it's not just these regimes that will allow for access to actually impact one's ability to interpret content. We also need support networks, escalation protocols, and even explainability tactics to make these meaningful to the types of stakeholders who would be able to use them. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sam for a 5-minute or so presentation to add some more color, and then we will go into the much more dynamic portion of the meeting. But thanks so much.
This is very glad to be co-hosting this with PAI. The work is incredibly complementary, and the collaboration has been very fruitful. So I want to share some insights from Witness's work looking at this question of deepfake detection, access, and equity. Just to frame how Witness approaches this, and many of you are familiar with our work on deepfakes, that's grounded in our global work on how people use video and technology for human rights and civic journalism. The first is we very much focus on prepare, don't panic. And this type of work on an access protocol fits right within that. We also assume that people are trying to solve the problem of deepfakes, but that there is a lack of inclusion and that we're not listening necessarily to the right range of people globally with lived and expert experience of the threats and the solutions. And that's been very much how we've taken this detection question and tried to bring it to stakeholders who are critical on that, including, of course, in this meeting. You can see much more about our work on this site. I think the place I want to emphasize is very much our focus on trying to bring the deepfakes discussion to communities of misinformation stakeholders, people in social movements, human rights defenders, journalists in the range of global settings we mentioned here. And I'm going to draw on feedback from a series of meetings in 2019 to 20, and then a recent set of meetings in this year. But first, I actually want to contextualize this in a deepfake story from Myanmar from earlier this year. It took place in March, right in the middle of the meetings that PAI and Witness were holding, and featured this man, who is probably the second most prominent politician in Myanmar, appearing to confess in a video to corruption involving the de facto Prime Minister of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi. It caused significant stir in Myanmar, and almost immediately, people said it must be a deepfake. It came out as a story, people placed it in the online detectors that were available, which came back with results saying it was 95% likely a deepfake. People tried to pass through the lip movements, and this turned into a news story in Myanmar about the government using deepfakes detection technology. And I'm going to come back to this story at the end because I think it really highlights a lot of the issues we heard as we started to talk about deepfakes detection, access, and equity. So hold this story in your head as you think about the next things we heard. So 2 rounds of feedback I want to describe. First, 2019 to 20, we held a series of meetings bringing together stakeholders. One of the elements we asked about was how to solve for some of the questions around deepfakes. And I want to name 2 things that consistently came up and we always want to remind people of whenever we talk about deepfakes detection is, of course, first people said, please address existing problems around shallow fakes, so miscontextualized, lightly edited videos. Focus on deepfakes, but don't do it to the exclusion of other media manipulation detection problems. And the second is they emphasize something around the liar's dividend, which is this idea that people can claim something is fake even when it's not, and that is as powerful as faking media and is used by the powerful against footage, particularly from people who don't have power. So media forensics cuts both in terms of proving true and also proving that a claim that something is faked is not true. And they also highlighted the issues that Claire and Aviv and Sean have explored in the paper, the detection dilemma, which is, for example, in Brazil, we heard in our report, people asking for cheap and available media forensics tools combined with capacity. We heard in convening in South and Southeast Asia, people saying, we want accessibility to detection systems, a capacity for shared media forensics, and experts who can help us. And you're going to hear resonances of this in some of the areas that then emerged in our follow-up research. So as Claire said, we've thought about this detection dilemma from a global perspective with a particular focus on the issue of equity. How do you have access to tools and the capacity to use them more globally available and dispersed? And so that involved doing follow-up work both in convenings and in individual conversations with folks who had participated in a number of the convenings 2020 to 2021. So some things, key takeaways we heard from presenting the detection dilemma, and we particularly focused on who gets access to tools, what type of access they get, and who decides on that access. And these are some of the questions we're going to come back to in the breakouts. So on the access question, we heard people saying you need support and access for journalists and fact checkers, societally trusted leaders, and community organizations and people who are on the front lines. We heard people talking about contextually appropriate intermediaries and escalation options. And I've shared an example here from the Brazil meeting where people talked about Abrage, which is a coalition of investigative journalists. Could they help provide access to these tools? We also heard people saying that they wanted open source and open access solutions as well as non-commercial solutions. And I think this is something we're going to grapple with as we look at the detection dilemma, is the tension between going via trusted intermediaries and open access, and also how do we provide non-commercial solutions in places where people don't have the resources to buy commercial solutions. And then they wanted these accompanied by relevant media literacy and interpretation skills. Here are some complications on that access question that we heard. And these were framed, I think, around questions of exclusion and inadequate intermediaries. So many times people did lean towards kind of what I think in the detection dilemma paper we talk about as a kind of a Goldilocks option, which is controlled access to a detection mechanism via an intermediary. And they emphasized that needed to be paired with open access options particularly to provide access for the most vulnerable and the most under-resourced. There were very significant concerns about exclusion at a community level and for the most vulnerable, particularly if it came to commercial tools. And there was a real call to be sensitive to who are actually the trusted intermediaries and not to make naive assumptions about who they are. They're very contextually relevant. For example, if you rely on the dominant media in any society, how complicit are they with power in pretty much every context? Are they a valid intermediary? So as we look at intermediaries and think about who may be able to provide access to deepfake detection, how are we factoring in power and its implications there? And then the final set of takeaways really focused on this one, and I think this was really, I want to particularly emphasize this, is that access without training or expertise and without the presence of escalation options could lead to adverse consequences. And we really heard this very clearly, and it's very much reinforced in the Myanmar case study. So I'm going to finish up with just coming back to that case study that took place in March this year. And we have a blog post that outlines this in much more detail and a Wired op-ed that talks about it. So if you want to dig more into the case. So in this case, what happened was journalists in Myanmar were unable to verify the video. They had no ways to either use their own skills or escalate it adequately. Citizens only had recourse to open source tools without understanding the failings of those tools and with Twitter speed sharing of the results. And what landed was an assumption that this was a deepfake that has lasted. So I'm just posting a quote from a Twitter quote from 2 days ago. Unfortunately, U Pyomin Ten, the minister here, has just been admitted in critical condition to a hospital with COVID. There are lots of suspicions about that because people are saying, well, he faked to confess. They faked his confession, now they're going to kill him. So no one will ever know the truth. But also basically people in Myanmar think this was a deep fake. And this is due to all of these sort of structural failings about how we support people to better discern how we provide access to tools. This is not likely to be a deep fake, and I'm happy to go into it, but the conclusion we reached talking to experts and as people came to me and others like Henry Ajda, who's on this call, was this wasn't a deep fake, but no one in the national level had the capacity to do that, and no one had the skills to interpret it in a population. So some takeaways from the detection case in Myanmar that reinforce some of the things we've been saying. Detection wasn't relevant, accessible, useful, matched with skills and tools. Open access tools without support or contextualization of how to use them are often more dangerous than useful, and they move very fast. Multiple actors try to identify deepfakes simultaneously, and professional actors like news journalists are the slowest. This took about 30 minutes to go out on Twitter as identified as a deepfake based on the open source tools. Limited understanding of deepfake synthesis and detection. People don't know that a tool only works for certain deepfake techniques, for example. Lack of journalistic skills, no way to reach out to expert capacities, no escalation capacity for complex media forensics. And of course, this all took place in the context of the liar's dividend, where people are suspicious of real and faked with legitimate reasons. So let me just wrap up by saying we have some recommendations in our work that we're putting out there, that we need a governance protocol, but importantly, alongside that, we need investment in access to skills and capacity. We need to think about a standing media forensics capacity that people can recourse to. We do need open access and non-commercial tools. And for companies in this space, and this is something that those of us working on norms and codes of principles around synthesis have said, is we need resource sharing to detection efforts appropriate to the products that are being built.